The truth didn't arrive in town with justice. It arrived with dust on boots and a name already condemned. Before we continue, tell me where you're listening from. Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you believe in justice that doesn't need a gun to prove itself, stay with me until the end. Now listen closely, because what happened on the Whitaker Ranch didn't begin with a crime. It began with a rumor. The first whisper spread through Mason Creek just after sunrise. A man at the general store said he saw Luke Whitaker dragging something heavy across his land the night before. Something wrapped, something he refused to describe twice. By noon, that whisper had become a certainty, and certainty is a dangerous thing in a town that survives on guesses. Marshal Grant Cole stood outside the sheriff's office holding a folded telegram, reading it twice, then a third time, as if repetition could turn suspicion into fact. "Whitaker," he muttered, tightening his jaw. "They say it's him." Across the street, Victor Harlan leaned against the hitching post like a man who already knew how the story would end. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "If a man is seen hiding things on his own land," Victor said quietly, "then the land itself becomes evidence." Cole didn't answer right away. The weight of responsibility didn't sit well with him, but silence from authority is often mistaken for agreement. And that was enough. Within an hour, boots were moving. Horses were saddled. Men who had never met Luke Whitaker were already convinced they knew him. Miles away, Luke was alone behind his ranch house, hammering a loose fence board back into place under a sky so wide it made everything feel smaller than it should. The ranch was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after years of choosing isolation over company. He paused for a moment, looking toward the horizon, unaware that every mile of distance between him and town was being erased in conversation, in accusation, in assumption. Behind him, the barn stood still, its doors closed, its contents unseen, its silence already misinterpreted by people who had never stepped inside. Luke wiped sweat from his brow, exhaled slowly, and continued working, not knowing that the word guilty had already traveled faster than any rider could. Back in town, Marshal Cole finally lowered the telegram. "We ride in 10 minutes, he said. No one asked why. No one asked what proof meant. Because in Mason Creek, belief often outruns truth. Victor Harlan smiled just slightly as he mounted his horse. "Let's see what the ranch is hiding," he said. And with that, the line of riders turned toward the open land, cutting through the dust like a decision already made, while Luke Whitaker, still unaware, kept working under a sky that had no warning for what was coming his way. By the time the first riders crossed the dry riverbed, the rumor had already grown teeth. It was no longer a question of what Luke Whitaker might have done. It had become a certainty in the minds of men who had never asked him a single question. Marshal Grant Cole rode at the front, his posture rigid, eyes scanning the land ahead as if the horizon itself might confess something useful. Dust clung to the horses like a second skin, rising in slow waves behind them as the sun leaned lower in the sky. Victor Harlan rode slightly behind the marshal, calm in a way that did not match the weight of the situation, as if he was simply observing a story he had already read before. "We are close," one of the deputies said, though no one had asked. The words fell into the wind and disappeared without response. The land here stretched wide and empty, broken only by fence lines and scattered oak trees bent by years of wind. It was the kind of place where silence felt permanent, where every sound seemed borrowed from somewhere else. And somewhere ahead, beyond the rise of a low hill, Luke Whitaker continued working at his ranch, unaware that the world had decided to converge on him. Inside the town, just hours earlier, the story had sharpened again. A second claim surfaced, this time from a traveling trader who said he saw a light moving inside Luke's barn late the previous night. Not fire, not lanterns, but something covered, something carried carefully. That detail spread faster than the rest because it gave imagination something to hold onto. Marshal Cole had tried to dismiss it at first, but dismissal becomes harder when too many people begin repeating the same uncertainty. Evelyn Hart arrived in town just before the riders left. She stood at the edge of the square, watching the preparation with a face that did not belong to panic, but to recognition. "You are going the wrong direction," she said quietly as Cole passed her. He slowed for a moment, but did not stop. "Then explain it," he replied. Evelyn looked toward Victor Harlan before answering. "I cannot explain it here," she said. That was all she gave. And yet those words followed the riders out of town like a shadow that refused to stay behind. Back on the ranch, Luke finished repairing the fence and rested his hand on the rough wood, feeling the vibration of something steady and familiar. The sky above him stretched endless and pale, streaked with thin clouds moving too slow to notice. He turned toward the barn for the first time that afternoon, not because he had heard anything, but because something about the air felt different, like the world had shifted its weight without warning. Inside the barn, unseen from the outside, there was a locked section of space he rarely opened. Not because it held danger, but because it held responsibility. A responsibility he had not asked for, but had not refused either. He exhaled slowly, wiped his hands on his sleeves, and walked toward the barn door. At that same moment, the riders crested the hill in the distance. Marshal Cole raised his hand slightly, signaling the group to slow. From here, the ranch was visible in full, quiet, still, unchanged on the surface. Victor Harlan narrowed his eyes. "That is the place," he said. No one asked how he knew. No one needed to. And as the group began their descent toward the ranch, Luke Whitaker reached for the barn latch, unaware that the first real answer to every rumor was already waiting on the other side of that door, and that once it opened, nothing about this day would remain the same. The ranch came into view like a held breath finally released, quiet, still, and waiting for something no one had named out loud yet. Marshal Grant Cole slowed his horse as the group descended the last stretch of dry ground, his eyes fixed on the weathered buildings ahead. The air felt heavier here, not because of danger, but because of expectation, like the land itself was waiting to see what kind of truth would be spoken on it. Victor Harlan rode slightly forward, his gaze locked on the barn with a focus that felt too precise to be coincidence. Evelyn Hart remained near the back of the group, her hands tightly wrapped around the strap of her satchel, as if holding onto it was the only thing keeping her steady. Luke Whitaker stepped toward the barn door at the exact moment the riders began to fan out across the ridge. He did not see them yet. His attention was on the latch in front of him, a simple piece of iron worn smooth by years of use. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the sound of hooves just far enough to make him pause. Luke turned his head slowly toward the horizon. That was when he saw them. A line of riders descending toward his property, not rushing, not charging, but arriving with a purpose that could not be mistaken for chance. He stood still for a moment, one hand resting on the barn door, the other lowering slightly, as if trying to understand what he was looking at before deciding how to respond. Inside the group, Marshal Cole raised his hand again, signaling a controlled approach. The ranch was now fully visible, its fence lines stretching unevenly across the land, its main house worn but intact, its barn standing slightly apart like a separate world. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing looked like the kind of place that would justify what people in town had been saying. That realization did not ease Cole's tension. It deepened it. Because when accusations do not match what the eyes see, doubt becomes heavier, not lighter. Victor Harlan finally spoke as they came within shouting distance. "That is far enough," he said quietly, though no one had given him authority to command anything. The group slowed anyway. Luke stepped away from the barn door now, turning fully toward the riders. His expression was not fear, but confusion layered with restraint. "You are on my land," he said, voice steady but low. Marshal Cole dismounted first. His boots hit the dirt with a firm sound that carried across the silence. "Luke Whitaker," he called out, "we need to speak with you." Luke glanced between them, taking in the formation, the spacing, the way no one had yet lowered their suspicion. "About what exactly?" he replied. Cole hesitated for half a second, just long enough for Evelyn Hart to step forward from the group. Her voice broke the stillness, not loudly, but clearly. "They think you are hiding something here." Luke blinked once, then looked toward the barn behind him as if hearing the accusation for the first time in a language he almost understood but did not fully recognize. "Hiding something," he repeated quietly. Victor Harlan's voice followed immediately. "We all heard the same story in town. People do not invent things without reason." Luke studied him for a long moment, then turned back to Marshal Cole. "If you are here for reason, then ask me directly." The wind passed through the ranch again, brushing dust across the ground between them. Marshal Cole exhaled slowly. He had handled disputes before, but this was different. There was no visible crime, No clear victim, only layers of testimony stacked against a man who stood alone in front of his own barn. "We were told you brought something here," Cole said carefully. Luke's eyes shifted slightly. Not defensive, not guilty, just aware. "That is not something I can explain in words alone," he said. From behind Cole, one of the deputies adjusted his stance, hand hovering near his belt without commitment. Evelyn noticed it immediately. "Wait," she said, her voice sharper now. "If you go in like this, you are going to misunderstand everything." Victor Harlan stepped forward at the same moment. "Or we are going to confirm exactly what we already know," he said. Luke looked between them all again, then toward the barn door he had been about to open. The latch was still within reach, still slightly lifted from his earlier movement. For the first time since the riders arrived, the silence around the ranch felt different, not empty, but compressed, like the moment before something important is finally revealed. "Luke." Whitaker placed his hand back on the barn door slowly, not opening it yet, but not stepping away either. "If you are going to see this," he said quietly, "you need to understand why it is here first." And behind him, inside the barn, something shifted just slightly in the dark, not moving toward them, but waiting to be understood. The air around the ranch had changed in a way no one could point to, as if the land itself had tightened its silence around the people standing on it. Luke Whitaker kept his hand on the barn door, not moving, not opening it, but not stepping away either. Marshal Grant Cole watched him closely now, not with accusation alone, but with something closer to uncertainty that he refused to name out loud. Evelyn Hart stood slightly behind the group, her eyes shifting between Luke and the barn as if she already understood that what they were waiting for was not a crime, but a misunderstanding large enough to break a man's life in half. Victor Harlan, however, seemed less uncertain than the others. His attention remained fixed on the barn, steady and deliberate, like someone waiting for a moment they had already rehearsed. "You are delaying this," Victor said calmly. Luke turned his head slightly. "I am making sure you understand what you are about to see," he replied. His voice was steady, not defensive, not aggressive, just controlled in a way that made it harder to dismiss. Marshal Cole stepped forward half a pace. "Then explain it now," he said. Luke hesitated for a moment, then slowly released his grip on the barn door, but still did not open it. "A few days ago," he began, "I found something on the northern edge of my land. Not something I was looking for. Something that should not have been left alone." The words were careful, chosen not to provoke reaction, but to establish context. None of the riders spoke. Even the horses seemed still, as if reacting to the tone more than the content. Luke continued, "It was not a decision. It was responsibility." Evelyn's expression changed slightly at that word. Responsibility. Not guilt. Not secrecy. Responsibility. That distinction mattered more than anyone was willing to admit yet. Victor Harlan finally looked away from the barn and toward Luke. "That is a very convenient way to describe hiding something," he said. Luke met his gaze without raising his voice. "If I was hiding something," he replied, "I would not have stayed here waiting for all of you to arrive." That answer created a brief silence that no one immediately filled. Marshal Cole shifted his stance, unsure now whether he was standing in front of a suspect or a man refusing to be misunderstood. Evelyn took a slow step forward. "Let him finish," she said quietly. Luke nodded once. "What is inside that barn is not mine in the way you are assuming," he said. "It is something I chose to protect until I could figure out what to do with it." One of the deputies glanced toward Marshal Cole, waiting for instruction, but Cole did not respond. The certainty he had arrived with was beginning to fracture in small, almost invisible ways. Luke finally placed both hands on the barn door again, this time more firmly. "I am going to open it," he said, "but I need you to understand that what you are expecting to find is not what is there." The wind passed through the ranch again, lifting dust from the ground and carrying it briefly across the space between them. Then Luke pulled the barn door open. Inside, the structure was dim but organized, not chaotic, not suspicious, just carefully arranged in a way that suggested time and caution rather than concealment. Near the center of the barn stood several crates and a covered section of floor space, not locked, not hidden behind anything aggressive, but deliberately placed away from immediate view. Evelyn stepped closer first, her breath slowing as she tried to understand what she was seeing before assigning meaning to it. Marshal Cole followed, slower, more cautious. Victor Harlan stayed where he was for a moment longer, watching Luke instead of the barn. "What is this?" Cole asked finally, his voice lower now. Luke did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked a few steps inside and stopped near the covered section. "This is why I did not want assumptions to decide what you see," he said. Then he reached down and gently lifted part of the covering, not revealing danger, but revealing something that shifted the entire weight of the moment into a different direction. Evelyn's hand moved to her mouth instinctively, not in fear, but in realization. Marshal Cole did not speak. Victor Harlan narrowed his eyes, but for the first time, something uncertain flickered behind his expression. Luke looked back at them. "Now," he said quietly, "tell me again what you think I was hiding." And for the first time since the riders arrived, no one answered immediately, because the story they had brought with them no longer fit the reality standing in front of them inside the barn. The silence inside the barn did not break immediately, because what had just been revealed did not ask for noise. It asked for understanding. Marshal Grant Cole stood closest, his eyes fixed on the covered space Luke Whitaker had just exposed, as if looking away would make the meaning change. Evelyn Hart stepped forward slowly, her breath controlled but uneven, her attention drawn not to fear, but to recognition that was still forming. Victor Harlan remained near the entrance, watching the others instead of the barn itself, as though measuring their reactions mattered more than the truth in front of him. Luke stood to the side now, no longer blocking anything, but also no longer explaining, because some things could not be explained without being seen first. Inside the barn, what was revealed was not chaos or concealment, but careful arrangement. Supplies, documents, and records were stored with deliberate structure, as if someone had been maintaining order under pressure rather than hiding wrongdoing. Evelyn stepped closer to a stack of papers placed on a wooden crate. Her fingers hesitated before touching them, as if even contact required permission from the truth itself. Marshal Cole finally spoke, but his voice had changed. It was lower now, less certain. "What is all of this?" he asked again. But this time the question was not an accusation. Luke exhaled slowly. "Evidence," he said simply. Victor Harlan gave a short, quiet laugh that carried no humor. "Evidence of what exactly?" he asked. Luke turned his gaze toward him. "Of what was taken and what was ignored," he replied. The words settled into the space like weight, not loud enough to accuse, but heavy enough to shift attention. Evelyn picked up one of the documents carefully. Her eyes moved across it once, then again, slower this time. Something in her expression changed, not suddenly, but in layers, like realization refusing to arrive all at once. "These are records," she said quietly. Marshal Cole stepped closer now, finally looking directly at what she was holding. The paper showed dates, land markings, and sign notices that had not been mentioned in any of the reports brought to town. Not fabricated, not exaggerated, but overlooked. Intentional oversight was harder to confront than false accusation, because it did not have a single face to blame. Luke watched them read without interrupting. "I found them after I started asking questions about the northern boundary," he said. "At first I thought it was a mistake. Then I realized it was consistent." Victor Harlan's expression tightened slightly. "Consistent with what?" he asked. Luke looked at him directly now. "With land being moved on paper long before it was moved in reality." The barn felt smaller after those words, not physically, but in how it held attention. Marshal Cole lowered his gaze to another document, scanning lines that suggested agreements made without full transparency. Evelyn set the first paper down and reached for another, her movements careful, as if disturbing the order too quickly might collapse the meaning she was trying to understand. Luke continued, "What I brought here was not something to hide. It was something I could not leave unattended while I tried to confirm what I was seeing." Victor finally stepped inside the barn, breaking the distance he had kept until now. His boots hit the wooden floor with slow precision. "And you decided to become judge, jury, and caretaker," he said. Luke shook his head once. "No," he replied. "I decided not to ignore it until someone else decided what it meant without looking." A long pause followed. Even the wind outside seemed less aggressive now, as if it had also paused to listen. Marshal Cole straightened slightly, his earlier certainty no longer present. "If what you are showing is real," he said carefully, "then this goes beyond anything we were told." Luke did not respond with satisfaction or relief. He simply nodded once. "That is why I did not want assumptions leading this moment," he said. Evelyn turned back toward the center of the barn, where more materials remained covered but organized. "There is more," she said quietly, not as a question, but as an observation. Luke nodded again. "Yes," he said, "and it connects to why people started looking in my direction instead of looking at what was happening around them." Victor's eyes narrowed slightly, but for the first time, he did not interrupt. The truth inside the barn was not dramatic in appearance, but it was heavy in implication, and everyone present understood, without saying it out loud, that what they were seeing was not the end of a suspicion, but the beginning of a much larger realization that none of them had been prepared to face. The air inside the barn felt different now, not because anything had changed in its structure, but because everything had changed in what people believed it contained. Marshal Grant Cole stood still for a long moment, his eyes moving between the documents spread across the wooden crates, and Luke Whitaker, who remained calm but watchful at the edge of the space. Evelyn Hart continued reading silently, page after page, her expression tightening in ways that suggested the truth was not a single moment, but a pattern she was only now beginning to see. Victor Harlan, however, had shifted position slightly deeper into the barn, no longer observing from distance, but no longer fully engaging either, as if recalibrating his understanding of what he had walked into. Luke broke the silence first. "You are seeing the part that can be read quickly," he said. "There is another part that takes longer to understand." Marshal Cole finally looked up. "Then explain it in a way that makes sense," he replied, his voice no longer sharp, but burdened. Luke nodded once. "People in town heard fragments," he said. "A missing shipment, land disputes, movement of property records. Each fragment became its own." Conclusion. Evelyn paused at that, holding a page closer to the light filtering through the barn boards. "These records show inconsistencies across multiple transactions," she said quietly. Victor Harlan finally spoke from the side. "Inconsistencies do not prove intent," he said. Luke turned toward him. "No," he replied, "but patterns do." A long silence followed, one that stretched through the barn like a slow current. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying faint dust across the threshold. Inside, Marshal Cole moved closer to the central crates and carefully reviewed another stack of documents. His posture had changed now, less rigid, more analytical, as if the responsibility he carried had just expanded beyond what he expected when he arrived. "If this is accurate," Cole said slowly, "then this is not a local misunderstanding. This is organized misrepresentation of land and ownership." Evelyn lowered the document in her hands. "And it explains why someone would want attention directed away from it," she added. Victor Harlan's gaze narrowed slightly, but he did not respond immediately. Luke remained calm, but his voice carried a quieter weight now. "When I first found these records, I did not know what they meant in full," he said. "I only knew they did not match what I was seeing on the ground." Marshal Cole looked toward him. "So you stayed here," he said. Luke nodded. "I stayed because once people start believing a simple story, they stop looking for anything more complicated." That sentence lingered in the air longer than the others. Evelyn walked slowly toward the far end of the barn where additional covered materials were stacked. She hesitated before speaking again. "There are references here to land surveys that were never filed correctly," she said, "and signatures that appear in multiple locations on the same dates." Victor Harlan stepped forward again, this time closer to the center. "You are suggesting falsification," he said. Luke met his gaze directly. "I am suggesting verification is what matters now," he replied. Marshal Cole exhaled slowly, glancing at the group as if trying to determine where authority belonged in a situation where facts were still unfolding. "We came here thinking we were going to confirm a suspicion," he said. "Instead, we are looking at something far more complex." Evelyn nodded slightly. "And far more deliberate," she added. Luke moved a few steps toward the center of the barn, stopping near the documents. "Nothing in here appeared overnight," he said. "It built over time, in small adjustments, small decisions that individually looked harmless." Victor's expression tightened again, but his voice remained controlled. "You are still asking us to accept your interpretation," he said. Luke shook his head. "No," he replied. "I am asking you to look at what is in front of you without replacing it with what you expected to find." A quiet tension filled the barn again, not from confrontation, but from recalibration. Marshal Cole finally closed the folder he had been reviewing. We will need time to verify all of this, he said. Luke nodded once more. That is all I ever intended, he said. Evelyn looked around the barn slowly, as if realizing that what they were standing in was not a place of concealment, but a place of delayed disclosure. Then the question is no longer what he was hiding, she said quietly. It is who else has seen this before now. Victor Harlan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the open barn door, where the light outside seemed unchanged, as if the world beyond this moment had not yet realized what had already shifted inside it. The barn no longer felt like a place of suspicion, but it had not yet become a place of clarity either. It existed somewhere in between, suspended in a fragile balance where every person inside was forced to reconsider what they thought they knew. Marshal Grant Cole stood with his arms lowered now, the documents in his hands no longer treated as accusations, but as evidence requiring patience. Evelyn Hart remained near the center stack of papers, her eyes moving carefully from one page to another, as if each line was part of a larger structure she was still assembling in her mind. Luke Whitaker stayed slightly apart from them, not withdrawn, but deliberately still, giving space for interpretation rather than forcing direction. Victor Harlan, however, had moved closer to the barn entrance again, his posture angled outward, as if measuring how the world beyond this structure might respond once word of what was inside began to spread. Marshal Cole finally spoke after a long pause. If these records are legitimate, he said slowly, then we are dealing with something that extends beyond one property. Evelyn nodded without looking up from the page she was holding. They reference multiple parcels across county lines, she said. Not just adjustments, but patterns of consistent alteration over time. Luke listened quietly, then added, that is what made me stay here instead of taking this to town immediately. Patterns are not understood in isolation. Victor Harlan turned slightly toward him. Or they are interpreted in a way that fits whoever is presenting them, he said. Luke met his gaze without raising his voice. That is why I did not present anything. I simply preserved it until it could be verified. A soft tension returned to the space, not loud, but persistent, like pressure building behind a closed door. Marshal Cole looked down at another document, his expression tightening again as he traced a line of recorded signatures that did not match expected filings. These approvals should have required oversight, he said. Evelyn responded immediately, her tone careful but firm. Either oversight was bypassed, or it was never applied in the first place. Luke stepped forward slightly now, not to interrupt, but to clarify. When I first found discrepancies, he said, I assumed it was administrative error. But errors do not repeat with this level of consistency across time. Victor Harlan's jaw tightened subtly, though his voice remained controlled. You are still asking us to accept a conclusion based on your interpretation, he said. Luke shook his head once. No, he replied. I am asking you to accept that what is written here exists independently of interpretation. A long silence followed, one that felt heavier than the earlier confrontation outside. Marshal Cole slowly placed the document back onto the crate. If this is verified, he said quietly, it will require a full review of every transaction tied to this region. Evelyn looked up for the first time in several minutes. And it will require determining who benefited from these changes, she added. Luke did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked toward the open barn door, where light from the afternoon sun stretched across the wooden floor. That is what I could not ignore, he said finally. Because once I saw the scale of it, I realized it was not about one accusation. It was about how easily assumptions replace examination. Victor Harlan stepped closer into the center of the barn now, his voice lower than before. And yet you chose to stay isolated with it, he said. Luke answered without hesitation. I stayed because bringing incomplete understanding into a town already shaped by rumor would not have prevented anything. It would have accelerated misunderstanding. Marshal Cole exhaled slowly, looking between the papers and Luke. Then why show us now, he asked. Luke paused for a moment before replying. Because you did not come here based on rumor alone anymore, he said. You came here and chose to look. Evelyn placed the document she had been reading back down carefully. That changes responsibility, she said softly. Outside the barn, the wind moved across the ranch again, lifting dust along the fence line in slow waves. Inside, no one moved for several seconds, as if each person was waiting for the next layer of truth to reveal itself before deciding what the previous layer meant. Marshal Cole finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "We will need confirmation from independent sources," he said. Luke nodded. "That is the only way forward," he replied. Victor Harlan did not argue, but his silence now carried a different weight, less confident than before. Evelyn looked once more at the stack of documents. "Whatever this leads to," she said, "it did not begin here." Luke responded simply, "No, it did not begin here. But this is where it became visible." And in that moment, the barn no longer felt like the center of a conflict, but like the edge of something much larger that none of them had fully stepped into yet. The ranch was no longer a place of suspicion or confusion. It had become something else entirely, a place where silence felt heavier because truth had begun to take shape inside it. Marshal Grant Cole stood near the center of the barn now, no longer holding himself like a man ready to enforce judgment, but like a man carrying the weight of incomplete understanding. Evelyn Hart remained close to the documents, though she had stopped reading new pages and instead was revisiting earlier ones, as if the meaning required distance before it could be fully seen. Luke Whitaker stood slightly apart from them, his posture calm but steady, as though he had already accepted that what came next was no longer in his control. Victor Harlan had moved back toward the entrance again, but this time his attention was divided, shifting between the outside world and the growing realization inside the barn that certainty was no longer guaranteed. Marshal Cole finally spoke after a long silence. "We will need verification from county records and independent witnesses," he said. Luke nodded once. "That is expected," he replied. Evelyn looked up from the documents. "If this is verified," she said quietly, "then what we are looking at is not isolated error, but coordinated adjustment across time." Victor Harlan's expression tightened slightly. "That is a serious claim," he said. Luke responded calmly. "It is not a claim. It is what the documents show when placed side by side." The barn seemed quieter after that exchange, as if even the wind outside had reduced its movement. Marshal Cole walked slowly toward another crate, lifting a folder that had been placed beneath several layers of papers. His eyes scanned it briefly before he spoke again. "There are references here to agreements that were never brought before official review boards," he said. Evelyn stepped closer. "And signatures that appeared duplicated across unrelated filings," she added. Luke remained still, allowing them to follow the structure of evidence without interruption. "When I found these," he said, "I spent weeks trying to understand whether I was missing context. But context does not repeat itself in identical patterns unless something is controlling the repetition." Victor Harlan finally stepped fully into the barn again, his voice lower than before. "You are suggesting intentional manipulation of land ownership records," he said. Luke met his gaze directly. "I am stating that the documentation reflects outcomes that cannot occur naturally through error alone," he replied. Marshal Cole exhaled slowly, setting the folder down. "If that is true," he said, "then this extends beyond a local dispute. This becomes a matter for federal review." Evelyn looked toward Luke. "Is that why you stayed here instead of bringing this forward earlier?" she asked. Luke paused before answering. "I stayed because presenting incomplete understanding would have created conclusions without structure," he said. "And conclusions without structure are what create the kind of assumptions that brought you here in the first place." A long silence followed, heavier than before, not from tension, but from realization that the situation was no longer simple enough to resolve quickly. Outside the barn, the light had begun to shift slightly as the afternoon moved forward, casting longer shadows across the ranch. Inside, Marshal Cole looked at each stack of documents again, this time not as isolated pieces, but as parts of something larger. "We will need full access to all related records," he said finally. Luke nodded. "They are already organized for review," he replied. Evelyn exhaled softly, as if realizing the scale of what she was holding. "Then the question is no longer whether something happened," she said quietly. "It is how far it reaches." Victor Harlan did not respond immediately. His gaze lingered on the barn interior, then briefly toward Luke, as though recalculating the foundation of his earlier certainty. Marshal Cole closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. "We will proceed carefully," he said. Luke gave a slight nod. "That is the only way truth survives contact with assumption," he replied. The barn remained still after that, not because nothing had changed, but because everything had already begun changing in ways that would not fully reveal themselves until later, when the weight of verification finally met the reality of what had been uncovered. The barn had become quieter than any of them expected, not because nothing remained to be said, but because everything that mattered had already shifted into a different category of understanding. Marshal Grant Cole stood near the center of the space, no longer holding authority in the way he arrived with, but carrying responsibility in a quieter, heavier form that did not require words. Evelyn Hart remained beside the stacked documents, her attention now moving more slowly, as if she was no longer searching for what was hidden, but confirming what had already been revealed. Luke Whitaker stood with his back near one of the wooden beams, calm but no longer distant, as though he understood that the moment of isolation had ended. The second truth became shared rather than protected. Victor Harlan lingered closer to the barn entrance, but his posture had changed again, less confident, more measured, as if recalculating his position in a situation that no longer responded to certainty. Marshal Cole finally broke the silence, his voice steady but no longer sharp. "We will begin formal verification immediately," he said. Luke nodded once. "That is the correct next step," he replied. Evelyn looked between them. "And until that process is complete," she said carefully, "nothing should be treated as final conclusion." Victor Harlan exhaled slowly, his gaze still moving across the barn interior. "Assumptions have already traveled further than any verification will be able to reverse quickly," he said. Luke responded without hesitation. "That is why verification matters more now than ever," he said. A long pause followed, not tense, but reflective, as if each person was now aware that they were standing inside a transition rather than an ending. Marshal Cole turned slightly toward Luke. "You could have taken this directly to state authorities," he said. Luke shook his head. "If I had done that without structure, it would have been reduced to a claim," he said. "And claims without structure collapse under interpretation." Evelyn closed one of the folders gently. "What you preserve here prevents that collapse," she said. Luke acknowledged her with a slight nod. "It prevents premature interpretation," he replied. Victor Harlan finally stepped fully into the center of the barn, no longer observing from distance. "And yet you are still standing alone in the center of all of this," he said. Luke met his gaze calmly. "Not alone," he replied. "Observed." That answer shifted the silence again, not dramatically, but meaningfully, as if the word itself had changed the relationship between all of them. Marshal Cole looked toward the documents once more. "Then the next phase is clear," he said. "Chain verification across county records, followed by independent review," Evelyn added, "and cross-referencing of timing across all filings." Luke stepped slightly forward. "And transparency of process," he added. Victor Harlan did not interrupt this time. Instead, he looked toward the barn door, where light from outside continued to stretch across the floorboards. For the first time, his expression held less certainty and more calculation, not of advantage, but of consequence. Marshal Cole adjusted his stance, as though mentally transitioning from confrontation to procedure. "If what is here holds under review," he said slowly, "then the implications will extend beyond anything we anticipated when we arrived." Luke replied quietly, "That is why it had to be examined before it was spoken about in fragments." Evelyn looked at the group, then back at the documents. "Fragments create narratives," she said. "Structure creates understanding." The barn remained still again, not empty of meaning, but full of it in a form that required time to fully process. Marshal Cole finally closed the last folder he had been holding. "We will proceed carefully," he said again, but this time it carried a different tone, not obligation, but acknowledgement. Luke nodded once more. "Carefully is the only way truth remains intact long enough to be understood," he said. And as the group stood in the quiet of the barn, the tension that had defined the beginning of their arrival no longer existed in the same form. What remained was not resolution, but the beginning of verification and the understanding that what they had uncovered was no longer about suspicion, but about the responsibility of what comes after truth is no longer hidden.